She only asked to borrow his phone, but the first word she whispered into it made Ethan's blood run cold. Standing outside a coffee shop with his daughter sipping hot chocolate, he froze as a name he hadn't heard in 8 years cut through the noise of the street. The kind of name you bury deep until it comes back to life. Ethan had built a life out of small, careful routines. Early alarms that nobody heard but him, coffee that went cold while he packed an 8-year-old's lunch, and quiet walks to the bus stop where he listened more than he spoke. He kept to himself, not out of pride but out of practice, measuring his days by the steadiness he could give his daughter. The hardware store took most of his hours, and what it didn't take he gave to Sophie, letting her laughter set the rhythm in an apartment that always smelled faintly of clean clothes and lavender. Life was tight, yes, but in the way a good knot holds. It was theirs, and that was enough. Evenings belonged to Sophie. She colored sprawled on the floor with markers that always lost their caps, while Ethan sat cross-legged nearby, pretending to read instructions on a toy he'd already fixed. He learned the map of her expressions the way some people learn a city. The crinkle at the bridge of her nose that meant a joke landed. The way her eyes softened when she was tired and trying not to admit it. When she asked about things he couldn't give, new sneakers, a weekend trip, he didn't apologize. He offered what he always had on hand: time, attention, and the steady reassurance that tomorrow would be ordinary and safe. At work, he was the person other people leaned on without thinking. He could find the exact length of bolt a customer described with a shrug and a hand gesture, could carry 2 boxes at once without looking like he was trying. He took pride in leaving things better than he found them. Shelves faced, all's clear, small kindnesses that required no announcement. On slow days, he imagined the way Sophie would narrate his life if she were telling it to a classmate. "My dad knows how to fix anything," and let that imagined voice carry him through the last hour. Their apartment had a view of not much at all: a strip of sky, the top of a tree, a slice of street. Still, Ethan treated the view like a promise. He opened the windows whenever the weather allowed, let the fresh air move through the rooms, and lift the corners of bills taped to the fridge. He did laundry at night, so the clothes would be warm when Sophie got dressed in the morning. On the best nights, when she fell asleep mid-story with her cheek pressed to his arm, he stayed very still, as if any shift might rattle the fragile peace they'd built. Fridays were for small treats. Nothing big, never big, but something to mark the end of a week. A shared pastry, a new library book, a walk where they chose a different route home just to see what changed. That Friday the city wore the kind of light that made even worn sidewalks seem generous. They left the apartment carrying nothing they didn't need: his wallet, her wool hat, and moved toward the part of town where the pace slowed a little and the streets began to smell like coffee. Ethan didn't love coffee. He loved the idea of it, the pause it created. At the small shop on the corner, he ordered the cheapest black on the board and didn't pretend to taste notes of anything. He liked the warmth in his hands and the excuse to linger. Sophie, carefully, proudly, asked for hot chocolate and wrapped her fingers around the cup like it was a secret. They sat outside because she liked to watch people pass. The dog that trotted like it had a job, the couple arguing softly, the runner who nodded at everyone without breaking stride. "Are we rich today?" Sophie asked, which was her way of checking whether a second marshmallow might be negotiated. "Rich enough for one," Ethan said, and when she laughed, the sound bounced lightly, as if the city itself made room for it. He took a sip of coffee, too hot, and pretended it was fine. She told him about a class project and how her friend had glued the eyes on a paper owl upside down. She reenacted the teacher's face with theatrical horror. He didn't interrupt. He gave her the kind of listening that asked for nothing in return. He watched the street the way a careful man does, noting small things without cataloging them as threats. A delivery truck idling in the red, a cyclist weaving closer to parked cars than made sense, the way the sun slid down the glass of the building across from them and broke into pieces on the pavement. The air smelled like ground beans and city dust. Sophie swung her legs from the bench, heels thumping a quiet rhythm against the wood, a metronome for the life they'd tuned together. Nothing in the moment announced itself as important. That's how ordinary works. It hides significance in plain sight. Ethan threw away the flimsy cardboard sleeve from his cup and folded the empty packet of sugar into a neat square. He thought of the laundry he'd switch when they got home, of the math worksheet he'd initial, of the night being simple and predictable if he honored it with the same care he gave all their small, shared rituals. Sophie tilted her head back to catch a ribbon of steam, leaving her cup, and grinned when it kissed her nose. Magic, she declared, and he nodded because he believed her, because for once the word didn't feel like a reach. The light kept lowering, warming everything it touched. Ethan breathed in, exhaled, and let his shoulders settle. He had learned to recognize the rare instances when his mind wasn't already sprinting to the next task. This was one of them, a pause big enough to stand inside. He reached over and pressed his palm lightly against the top of Sophie's hat to straighten the seam. She did not swat him away. They were only as far from the door as the little metal table allowed, close enough to hear the grinder kick on, close enough for the smell to reach them first when a new pot finished. Ethan took another drink he didn't need and thought, with a quiet satisfaction he rarely named, that this easy, common evening, was proof he was getting something right. Across the street, a bus hissed to a stop and exhaled its passengers. A breeze lifted a corner of the napkin beneath Sophie's cup. He pinned it without looking, the motion familiar as breath. He didn't know yet that the next breath would carry a voice that would change everything, that the steady rhythm he'd relied on for years had already taken its last untroubled beat. For now, there was only the bench, the two cups cooling slowly, and the ordinary, generous light of a Friday that still belonged to them. The evening air carried the faint hum of traffic, steady enough that Ethan could half listen without really hearing it. He and Sophie sat close together, the little table between them dotted with crumbs and the last sips of hot chocolate. He had just started to think about the walk home when movement caught his eye, a woman stepping toward them, shoulders hunched as if bracing against more than the breeze. Her blazer hung wrinkled, like it had been grabbed from the back of a chair without thought, and strands of hair clung stubbornly out of place around her face. She didn't move with the casual rhythm of people leaving work or strolling into the cafe. Her pace had an edge, a flicker of urgency she couldn't hide. "Excuse me," she said, voice low, almost careful. "My phone's dead. Could I borrow yours? Just for a minute." Ethan stiffened. Years of caution had shaped his instincts. Caution for Sophie, for their small world where predictability was safety. Strangers rarely asked for much beyond directions, and something in the way this woman's eyes flicked toward the street told him this wasn't casual. He didn't answer right away. Sophie looked up from her cup, her mouth ringed with a thin mustache of cocoa. "Dad?" she whispered, the single word carrying a child's trust that he would decide what was safe. Ethan's thumb tightened around his coffee cup. He didn't like handing over his phone. It wasn't about the device itself, cheap, a little scratched, but reliable. It was about what it carried, photos of Sophie, work contacts, a map of his life too personal to surrender. The woman must have seen the hesitation in his face because her voice broke slightly as she added, "It's important." She swallowed, eyes lowering briefly before snapping back up, sharper now, almost pleading. "Please." Ethan searched her expression, noting the tremor at the corner of her mouth, the way her hands hovered near her pockets as though fighting the urge to wring them together. She wasn't lying about the urgency, that much was clear. The question was whether her urgency was his problem. Just one call. His tone carried more suspicion than he intended, but he needed to hear her confirm it. "One call," she promised, nodding quickly. For a breath, he weighed the choice. He could say no, protect the bubble of safety he had built for Sophie and himself. Or he could trust, just this once, that handing over a piece of himself wouldn't come back to harm them. Something in her desperation, genuine, raw, tipped him. He slid the phone from his pocket, the weight suddenly heavier in his palm. Slowly, he extended it toward her. "Don't go far," he said, voice firm, a rule more than a request. Her fingers brushed his as she took the phone, cool against his skin. She nodded in gratitude but didn't waste words. Instead, she turned a few steps away, angled her body so her back faced them, and began to dial. Ethan sat very still, coffee cooling between his hands, Sophie swinging her legs against the bench. He told himself not to care, not to listen. Yet the small sound of her voice, tentative, breaking, carried back to him, and with it, the first word that made his stomach clench. Not even a word, really. A name. "Jacob," she breathed into the phone. And the ground beneath Ethan's steady, carefully built life shifted. "Jacob," The single name slipped from the woman's lips like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through Ethan with a force he hadn't braced for. His grip on the coffee cup faltered, and he tightened his fingers until the cardboard creaked. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. Not since the night everything broke. His younger brother's face rushed back to him. Reckless grin, eyes that always seemed to carry a spark of mischief. Jacob had been the one person who could push Ethan out of his cautious shell. And then, without warning, without a reason, he had disappeared. No calls, no letters, not even a goodbye. The silence that followed had been worse than death. With death, at least, you bury someone. With Jacob, Ethan had been forced to bury only the questions. His chest tightened as if the years collapsed into this single moment. He forced himself not to move, not to betray the storm inside. Beside him, Sophie swung her feet, humming softly to herself, blissfully unaware of the weight that had just dropped into her father's world. The woman's voice wavered on the phone. "I found you. Please, you need to come back. Your daughter deserves to know you're alive." Ethan's head snapped up. Daughter. The word cleaved through him. For a moment he thought he'd misheard, that the years of longing had twisted the sound into something that fit his ache. But no, the tremble in her voice was too real, too specific. He looked at Sophie, who was licking chocolate from her thumb, her eyes round with innocent curiosity. She caught his gaze and smiled, but Ethan couldn't return it. His breath came uneven, shallow, like someone had just pulled the air out of the street around him. The woman hung up, shoulders sagging as though the call had drained her. When she turned back, she froze at the sight of Ethan staring, his expression tight and unreadable. She faltered, clutching the phone as if it anchored her. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to hear that." "Who are you?" Her question felt absurd. "Who am I?" He was the brother left behind. The man who had kept one chair empty at every holiday table, who had whispered Jacob's name into the silence just to remember what it sounded like. He swallowed, his voice rough when it finally emerged. "Who are you?" he asked back, sharper than intended. She lowered her eyes to the pavement. "My name's Laura. I know Jacob. I've been looking for him for months. He's not well. He's scared to face you, but I thought maybe." Her words tangled, caught between apology and urgency. Ethan's jaw tightened. Anger rose, hot and sharp, colliding with something colder. Fear, maybe, or the ache of hope he didn't trust. "Not well." His voice cracked despite himself. "He's been gone for 8 years. I buried him in my heart. And now you're standing here telling me." "Dad." Sophie's small voice cut through, tremulous with confusion. Ethan blinked, forcing himself to look down at her. Her eyes searched his face for reassurance. He fought to steady his breathing, to gather a mask he could wear for her sake. "It's fine, sweetheart," he murmured, though the words tasted like ash. "Just give me a second." When he turned back, Laura had stepped closer, urgency lighting her expression. "He's living 2 towns over. Alone. I think he wants to come back, but he's ashamed." He didn't know about Sophie. Ethan's world reeled. 8 years of unanswered questions pressed against him all at once. Every birthday celebrated with a shadow at the table. Every Christmas when he told himself family was whoever stayed, not whoever left. And now Jacob was alive, within reach, unaware he had a niece who deserved to know him. Laura's voice softened to a whisper. "I can take you to him. Right now." Ethan looked again at Sophie, her legs swinging idly, her cocoa mustache making her look impossibly young. She had no idea that her life had just cracked open, that a name she'd never heard was about to alter everything. The weight of choice pressed down on him, heavier than any he'd carried. 8 years of silence on one side, the fragile chance of reconciliation on the other, and all of it contained in one word. "Jacob." Laura kept her eyes fixed on Ethan, as if afraid he might walk away before she finished. Her hands clutched his phone tightly, knuckles white against the black case. "He's nearby," she said softly, the words almost trembling out of her. 2 towns over. In a small house, barely holding together. He doesn't let people in. But I found him." Ethan's jaw clenched, his voice low and harsh. "And you thought you'd find me too? Just hand me back my brother like he's been misplaced in a drawer." His tone startled Sophie, who blinked up at him. Ethan caught himself, dragging a hand over his face. His anger wasn't really for Laura. It was for the years stolen, for the nights he'd stared at a silent phone, waiting. Laura swallowed hard. I didn't plan this. I just, I thought maybe if you knew, you could, her voice cracked. He's ashamed. He doesn't know how to face you. Ashamed. The word lodged deep. Ethan had lived with 100 versions of Jacob's disappearance. Anger, rebellion, selfish freedom. Never once had he imagined shame. He stared at Laura, trying to read the sincerity in her expression. You said, his voice faltered, unsteady. You said he has a daughter. Laura's lips parted, hesitation flashing in her eyes before she nodded. Yes, she's young. He hasn't been the father she deserves. That's why I've been pushing him to come back, to reconnect. He's afraid, but he listens when I talk about her. I thought maybe if he saw you again, if he knew you had Sophie. Ethan felt the ground tilt. His brother, gone 8 years, hiding just a short drive away, carrying a secret family Ethan had never known. His heart pounded with betrayal and bewilderment. But under it all was something sharper. The possibility that Sophie had a cousin, a blood link she'd never been told about. He looked at his daughter, her cheeks flushed from cocoa and cold air, her eyes still darting between the adults like she was catching only pieces of a puzzle. How do I tell her? He wondered. How do I let her into this storm without breaking her world in half? Laura stepped closer, her voice urgent but gentle. He needs you. He doesn't know how to reach out, but he wants to. He's not strong right now. I think seeing you, it might save him. Ethan's throat tightened. Save him. For 8 years, he'd convinced himself Jacob didn't want saving, that he'd chosen silence. Now, the idea that his brother was still out there, hurting, hiding, pulled at something Ethan thought had long since hardened. Sophie tugged at his sleeve. Dad, is something wrong? He knelt beside her, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. No, sweetheart. Just an old friend I didn't expect to hear about. Give me a little more time, okay? She nodded, trusting as always. When he rose again, Laura's gaze was steady. Come with me. I'll take you to him. Tonight. The weight of choice bore down with brutal clarity. The safe world he'd built for Sophie, the small apartment, the simple routines, the promise of stability, stood on one side. On the other, the unanswered ache of family, a brother who might yet be pulled back from the edge. Ethan looked down at Sophie, swinging her legs, unaware that the next decision he made could redraw the map of their lives. He turned back to Laura, eyes clouded but resolute. Take me to him. Laura exhaled in relief, as if she had been holding her breath for hours. An hour later, the three of them stood on the edge of a quiet street, the air colder, the night deeper. Before them loomed a weathered house, its paint peeling, its windows dim. Ethan's heart pounded so loud he was sure Sophie could hear it. Inside was the brother he had buried in silence, and the truth that could not be undone. The drive felt longer than the distance suggested. The city lights fell away, replaced by stretches of dim roads that seemed to stretch endlessly, each mile feeding the weight in Ethan's chest. Sophie had dozed off in the back seat, her head leaning against the window, breath fogging the glass. Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, torn between the desire to protect her from what lay ahead and the knowledge that some truths refused to wait for the right time. Laura sat quietly in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap. She gave directions softly, pointing out turns as if she, too, understood that words carried too much power right now. Ethan didn't ask questions. His mind churned with its own noise. Why now? Why after 8 years? At last, they turned onto a narrow street on the town's edge. The houses here sagged with years of neglect, paint peeling, shutters hanging crooked, porches warped. Laura lifted her hand. That one. Ethan pulled to a stop. The house stood under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, its siding weathered, curtains drawn tight. For a moment, he couldn't move. His fingers stayed clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles pale. Are you ready? Laura asked softly. He let out a shaky breath. No, but I'm here. They stepped out into the night. Sophie rubbed her eyes, still sleepy, but followed her father's hand without complaint. She clutched his coat as they walked up the uneven path, her small steps matching his heavy ones. At the door, Ethan froze. His heart hammered so loudly he thought it might echo against the wood. The last time he had stood before his brother's home had been years ago, pounding on a different door that never opened. Now, here he was again, uncertain whether he wanted the door to stay shut or swing wide. Laura stepped forward and knocked, a steady rhythm that sounded far more confident than Ethan felt. For a long moment, Silence pressed against them. Then footsteps, slow, dragging, as though each one carried resistance. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. And there he was. Jacob. Thinner, older, his eyes sunken but still holding the familiar shape Ethan had known since childhood. The years had carved lines into his face, stolen the brightness from his smile, but there was no mistaking him. For a moment, neither brother spoke. The air between them felt brittle, crowded with all the words left unsaid for nearly a decade. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his body locked in place. Then Sophie peeked out from behind his leg, her presence breaking the stalemate. Jacob's gaze dropped to her, and in an instant, his eyes filled with tears. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. "This is Sophie," Ethan said, his voice cracking under the weight of it. "Your niece." Jacob's face crumpled. He dropped to his knees, trembling hands covering his mouth as sobs shook his thin frame. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, voice ragged, every syllable torn from a place deeper than regret. Ethan stood frozen for one more beat, then moved forward. He reached down, gripped his brother's shoulders, and pulled him into a fierce, trembling embrace. Years of silence shattered in that moment, replaced by the raw, undeniable fact of blood, of family. Sophie pressed closer to her father's side, her wide eyes taking in the fragile reunion, sensing even in her young heart that something important, something unspoken, had just shifted. The past could not be undone. But here, on a worn porch under a weak street lamp, the first step toward a different future had finally been taken. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of dust and something stale, as though the windows hadn't been opened in months. The furniture sagged with age, and the walls carried the weary quiet of a place lived in but not cared for. Yet none of that mattered to Ethan. His eyes were fixed on the man kneeling before him, the brother he had lost, the brother he had mourned, the brother now trembling at his feet. Jacob's shoulders shook with the force of his apology. "I'm so sorry," he whispered again, his voice cracking like it hadn't been used in years. The words tumbled out, broken, desperate, as if saying them might rewind time, might undo the silence of 8 long years. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat thick with all the emotions he had buried. Anger, grief, relief, love. He should have shouted. He should have demanded answers. But instead, he reached forward, pulled Jacob up, and held him close. The embrace was fierce, almost painful, as though both men feared the other might vanish if they let go. Ethan pressed his forehead against his brother's temple, eyes shut against the flood of tears he could no longer hold back. For so long, he had trained himself not to think of Jacob, yet here he was, real and shaking in his arms. Sophie stood a step behind, wide-eyed, uncertain. She looked between them, sensing the depth of what was happening without understanding all of it. When Jacob finally pulled back, his gaze landed on her again, and something broke open inside him. "Your niece," Ethan said softly, almost reverently, repeating the words that had lodged in his chest outside the door. "This is Sophie." Jacob's face crumpled. His eyes filled again, but this time with something gentler than despair. He lowered himself to one knee, trembling hands reaching toward the little girl as if asking permission. "Hi, Sophie," he whispered. "Hi, I'm your Uncle Jacob." Sophie tilted her head, then stepped closer, her small hand slipping into Ethan's first for reassurance before she stretched it out toward Jacob. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Hi." The moment cracked something open in all 3 of them. Jacob wept openly, and Ethan's chest ached at the sight, at the reality that Sophie, his daughter who had only known absence as normal, was now reaching across years of silence without fear. They moved inside, the 3 of them, and Laura quietly disappeared into the kitchen, giving them space. Jacob fumbled with takeout boxes on the coffee table, his hands still shaking, while Ethan sat beside him, Sophie tucked close on the couch. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the past. It was fragile, but alive, full of the weight of beginnings. At last, Ethan broke it. "We'll talk. About everything. But for now," he reached out, set a hand firmly on his brother's shoulder. "For now, you're here. And that's enough." Jacob nodded, tears slipping down his face as he whispered, "Thank you." That night, as the 3 of them shared food in Jacob's dim living room, Ethan realized a truth he hadn't expected. Forgiveness wasn't something you gave to release the other person. It was something you extended to set yourself free. And maybe, just maybe, family wasn't only defined by who never left. Sometimes it was defined by who found the courage to return.